gone to prison shorting stocks when they've stepped over some lines. So we're asking for an investigation by the SEC. The congressional investigation that's being asked for, I think, is right on the money. It's something that should happen because there were meetings, conversations, emails, correspondence between people who had everything to gain and with no background in education policy in writing this reg. They essentially said, hey, here's a good idea for a reg, and they listed it. It gets worse than that. One of the key education officials, after a conversation with one of the short sellers in which he listed the companies he was short selling, went on to give a public speech where he reportedly listed those companies as, oh, these are the bad guys. Well, talk about carrying water. That is, it's more than wrong, and it certainly undercuts the integrity of the process. Finally, I think, aside from the fact that this probably shouldn't have been done by regulation, it should have been done by legislation because, as was pointed out, when you have something that's this massive and affects so many people, literally millions of people going out, shouldn't that be subject to legislation? Of course, legislation, they wouldn't have succeeded. There weren't the votes. Just look at the lopsided vote in the House to defund the reg. And so it should probably have been even a regulation to begin with, but at least if they were going to do a regulation, they should have obeyed all the rules and done it in a fair and even process. That's not been done. We appreciate everybody coming out. This issue will not go away. It'll come back and it'll continue to come back. The rule that came out on June 2nd essentially said, oh, there'll be a 3-year delay before it gets fully implemented, because people were just screaming if you're using a bad unemployment year as your benchmark, then you're going to wipe out all of the student financial aid to the students who need it most based on a very unusual year. And so maybe to get some of the heat off them, they have stepped back and decided that they're going to implement over 3 years. I predict before 3 years is out, this thing will be dead as a dodo, because I think because there's a bipartisan feeling, as I say, cast the House didn't come up for a vote in the Senate, but the Senate could change between now and 3 years from now. And I suspect what we're going to see is this thing thrown out. But I also suspect that it will be used as a textbook example of how a regulation should not be made.
The floor is open for comments or questions. All we would ask is that you identify yourself, and if you have a question, ask it in the form of a question. Sure.
Hi. So you talked about the regulation.
And you are... Right.
You talked about the regulation being so unequitable and so biased. It's my understanding it only affects 2% of the programs, and they do have 3 years to comply. But when you have for-profits that make up, they have 10% of all students in both the default rate is about 50%. And then, for example, you have institutions like Bridgepoint whose dropout rate is 84%. And their bachelor's degree can cost up to $90,000. I was just wondering if you could address that.
So why don't you talk about process, and I'll...
Sure. I mean, in terms of the process, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. And most of the people I've seen who've been really critical of this haven't been critical for the bad apples. There's bad apples in any industry. And our feeling is you could have zeroed in on them. But to use another cliche, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, there are a lot of people who don't have jobs who have come out of, say, community college, or the same demographic. People in this economy who are most likely to be hard-pressed to repay or hard-pressed to graduate, frequently it's because of the economic conditions here, not necessarily because of the default of the school, and there should have been a brighter line between the two. Plus, just one other thing. If this thing had come up without the short sellers, sort of swimming around in the shark tank, willing to make a buck, I have a hard time taking it seriously if they care one way or another about the quality of education. They care that they're going to make a killing by the stock going down. And I think if you wanted to address the problems like the ones you mentioned, the better way to do it would be to zero in and do something that's a little more specific. And for example, all along they've talked about, originally they said, oh, we're going to address all these wide, broad educational issues. But then what did they do? You read the actual regulation and they're zeroing in on for-profit schools. They're leaving alone other schools, And one quick statistic, kids going to, and after you reach a certain age, you call people that age kids, but kids going to community colleges who have the same demographic have very similar outcomes. And for that matter, if you've talked to anybody who just graduated from school lately, whatever kind of school, it's a, what was it, 1,000 people for one job and that kind of thing. So I just think the process is flawed. If the process weren't flawed, then I think those points would be better taken. And the other thing is, I don't think you can broad brush it that way, because I think in the end you're going to have some good schools thrown out with the bad schools, and that hurts the students, because what's their other option? Where do they go? There's not enough room in community colleges, so where do they go? And that's my point.
Yeah, I think that the major thing outside of the short sellers and all that is it's such a targeted rule. I mean, if there's an issue associated with students being unable to repay their loans, that applies broadly to both the for and the not-for-profit part of the higher education sector, and that's a serious policy issue. Given the scale of this, I agree. I think it should have been a legislative, not a regulatory issue. And people forget that this is only one part of a very big 14-prong rulemaking that imposes other burdens on this sector as well. So it's just hard to justify that as a sort of starting out approach to dealing with a big problem. Now, I think we're going to have a big problem with student loans. And the way we now have the government being the sort of direct lender in this, we're going to have a whole bunch of originators out there who have no stake in the quality of those loans, and they're going to be on the government's books and the taxpayers' back in the end. So this isn't solving the real problem, and it's targeted quite narrowly. And the last point to just emphasize is, a regulation is a tax in its economic effects, and taxes are paid by those who ultimately bear the burden. In this case, it's going to be the students, not the for-profit colleges. So it's an attack that's poorly aimed on top of everything else.
Hi, I'm Jeb Gilligan with Davis Block. You mentioned Jeb Gilligan with Davis Block. You mentioned the U.S. Administrative Procedures Act, that you guys had some legal questions about it.
Could you speak up just a little more?
You mentioned the U.S. Administrative Procedures Act.
Right.
And you thought there might be some legal issues. What is the legal standard, and do you envision the fight against this to be a legal or a political battle?
Well, obviously, there's both, and and there's a need for additional discovery. Discovery in the broadest sense, not in the legal sense. What we have now are literally tens of thousands of emails, lots of very questionable activities by the people who did the reg, showing that they had no intention of having an open process. And what the next step, I believe, is first you're going to have the IG investigation, the Department of Education IG investigation. That's already begun. Then I would hope there would be a congressional investigation as well. And then at that point, you would sit down and decide, okay, is there critical mass for violation of the Administrative Procedures Act? It's been around since 1946. There's a broad consensus. Regulations have the effect of law. I mean, people can be fined, people can be regulated by regulations, and therefore it must be open, it must be fair, and if it's being done for some financial interest or being done in a way that most people, I believe, would not consider fair or open, you can make the argument to the judge that in fact it was violated. And since it was violated, that would, in effect, invalidate the regulation. Now, the political way, because you mentioned political as well, there's a couple of opportunities there. One is in the House, they did have the vote, which would have defunded the enforcement of the reg, because the House has the power of the purse. And so, yeah, you can have a reg, but you can't enforce it. There's no money. That would work if both houses pass it and it's signed by the president. That didn't happen. It passed by a broad and a bipartisan majority in the House. It was not did not pass the Senate, and so therefore it was not signed. So you have that. And then the second way is it can just be invalidated by Congress itself. They can just say this reg is without force of law. Congress trumps regulation. So those are the sort of the avenues going forward.
Did you want to, that's it? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Zach Mason. So you mentioned what happened with the stocks